Funny how a room full of million-dollar smiles can still feel colder than a winter sidewalk. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble, catching on diamonds, silk gowns, and perfectly rehearsed laughter, but none of it touched Emily Carter the way the red wine did when it spilled across the front of her dress, slow and deliberate, like a statement. A few heads turned, then more, whispers spreading in ripples as the deep stain bloomed against the pale fabric, and for a split second, everything went still, as if the room itself was waiting to see what the housekeeper would do, because that's what she was to them. Just a housekeeper wearing something she didn't belong in, standing beside a man who owned half the city. Emily didn't gasp, didn't flinch, didn't even look down right away. She simply lifted her eyes, calm, steady, and met the gaze of the woman holding the empty glass, a socialite with a smile too sharp to be kind. And then, slowly, Emily smiled back, not defensive, not embarrassed, just unshaken, and somehow that made the silence heavier than any insult could. Across the room, Alexander Reed noticed, his jaw tightening just slightly, not enough for anyone else to catch, but enough to betray the shift inside him, because this wasn't how the night was supposed to go. This was supposed to be simple, controlled, transactional, just one evening, one appearance, one role she was paid to play. Hours earlier, in a quiet corner of his penthouse overlooking the city skyline, he had placed the check on the table between them. Crisp, untouched, $5,000, he said, his voice measured, distant. All you have to do is be my date at the gala. And Emily had looked at the number, then at him, her fingers still wrapped around the cleaning cloth she hadn't put down yet. Just one night? She asked softly, and he nodded, already reaching for his phone as if the conversation was already finished. Just don't embarrass me, he added, almost absent-mindedly. And that was when she tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way no one ever did. What if I do? She asked, not challenging, just curious, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression before it disappeared behind the polished mask he wore so well. Now, standing in that glittering ballroom with wine soaking into her dress and eyes watching her like she was part of the entertainment, Emily finally glanced down, brushing the fabric lightly with her fingers, not to hide it, but to acknowledge it, as if it were nothing more than a drop of rain. Then she looked back up again, her posture straight, her chin lifted just enough to shift the balance of the moment, because she understood something they didn't, something Alexander himself had forgotten somewhere between boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. That dignity didn't come from the price of a dress or the invitation to a gala. It came from the way you chose to stand when everyone expected you to shrink, and in that quiet, deliberate stillness, before a single word was spoken, before the night truly began. Emily Carter had already done something no one in that room saw coming. She refused to play the role they had written for her. Alexander Reed stepped forward before anyone else could speak, his presence alone enough to shift the attention in the room like a spotlight snapping into place, his hand resting lightly at the small of Emily's back, not possessive, not performative, but deliberate, as if he were reminding the entire ballroom exactly who she was standing beside, and more importantly, who he was choosing to stand with. The murmurs softened, though not entirely, because curiosity in rooms like this never really disappeared. It only changed shape, and Emily could feel it pressing in from every direction, the weight of judgment wrapped in polite smiles and raised glasses, but she did not move away, did not shrink under it. She simply breathed in slowly, steadying herself the way she had learned to do years ago in far less forgiving spaces than this. Spaces where no one offered silk napkins or quiet apologies after crossing a line. Alexander leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You can step outside if you want. It was not a command, not even quite a suggestion, just an option, one he was not used to offering, and she turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, noticing for the first time that they were not as cold as everyone believed, just guarded, like doors that had not been opened in a long time. I am fine, she said, simple, certain, and something about the way she said it made him hesitate, as if he had expected something else, something easier, something that would confirm the narrative he understood. But Emily Carter had already begun rewriting that narrative the moment she chose not to react. The way they expected. A server approached with a fresh glass, his movements careful, almost apologetic, but Emily gently declined with a small shake of her head, instead reaching for a linen napkin and pressing it lightly against the stain, not trying to erase it, just managing it, the way she had learned to manage everything else in her life, quietly, without drawing attention, without asking for help that might come with conditions. Across the room, the woman who had spilled the wine watched closely, her smile tightening as the reaction she had anticipated failed to unfold, and around her, conversations began to resume, though now they carried a different tone, less certain, less amused, because what unsettled people more than a mistake was someone who refused to be defined by it. Alexander straightened, his posture returning to its usual composed precision, but his focus remained on Emily, studying the subtle way she held herself, the absence of panic, the absence of apology, and it struck him, unexpectedly, that in a room full of people who had spent years mastering the art of performance, she was the only one who seemed entirely real. "There is a terrace upstairs," he said after a moment, his voice carrying just enough for it to sound natural, quieter, and this time she nodded, not because she needed to escape, but because she understood the unspoken shift between them, the beginning of something neither of them had planned for when that check had been placed on the table. As they moved through the crowd, eyes followed, some curious, some critical, some calculating, but Emily did not look back, her steps measured, balanced, the heels unfamiliar, but no longer intimidating. And when they reached the staircase leading to the upper level, she paused for just a fraction of a second, her hand brushing the railing, grounding herself, before continuing upward beside him, leaving behind the noise, the judgment, and the version of herself they had already decided she was supposed to be, because whatever this night was meant to prove, it was no longer just about playing a role. It was becoming something else entirely, something neither money nor status could script, and Alexander Reed, for the first time in a very long time, was no longer certain he was the one in control. The terrace doors closed behind them with a soft click, and just like that, the noise of the ballroom faded into a distant hum, replaced by the cool night air and the quiet glow of the city stretching endlessly below, lights flickering like 1,000 silent conversations. Emily stepped forward, her heels tapping lightly against the stone floor, then slowing as she reached the railing, her fingers resting gently on the cool metal, grounding herself again, but this time it was different, not survival, not endurance, just a moment to breathe without eyes dissecting her every move. Alexander remained a few steps behind at first, watching her in a way he had not intended to, noticing the small details that did not belong in his world, the way she exhaled slowly as if releasing something she had been holding all evening, the way her shoulders relaxed not out of defeat but out of quiet control, and for a moment, he found himself unsure how to speak, which was something that almost never happened to him. "You handled that better than most people here would," he finally said, his voice steady but lacking its usual edge, and she let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it carried no amusement. "That is because most people here have never had to handle anything like that before," she replied, turning slightly to look at him, her expression calm but not distant, just honest. And that word alone seemed to land heavier than anything else she could have said. He stepped closer now, resting his hands lightly against the railing beside hers, not touching, but close enough that the space between them felt intentional. "You could have said something," he added, studying her reaction. "You could have called her out," and Emily shook her head slowly, her gaze drifting back toward the city lights. "No," she said quietly. "People like her are not surprised when someone fights back. They expect it. It makes them feel right, like they were correct about you all along." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly against the railing. "What they do not expect is for you to stay exactly who you are, even when they try to pull you out of it." And Alexander felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, because in his world, power was always loud, always visible, always proven through dominance or control, but what she was describing was something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not need validation. He glanced at her dress, the faint stains still visible under the soft terrace lighting. "You are not worried about that?" he asked, almost casually, but she followed his gaze and then smiled, not embarrassed, not defensive, just certain. "It is just a dress," she said. "It does not decide who I am." And there it was again, that steady, grounded certainty that made everything else feel smaller. A breeze passed between them, lifting a strand of her hair slightly, and for a brief second, Alexander remembered something he had not thought about in years, a time before expectations, before calculated moves and guarded conversations, when things were simple and people said exactly what they meant, and he realized, almost reluctantly, that Emily Carter was the first person in a very long time who made him feel like he did not need to anticipate the next move. "Why did you say yes?" he asked suddenly, the question sharper than he intended, and she did not answer right away, her gaze dropping for just a moment as if weighing how much of the truth to give, before she looked back at him, steady as ever. "Because I needed the money," she said plainly. Then after a small pause, softer this time, "But also because I wanted to see what kind of man offers something like that." And the words hung between them. Not accusatory, not curious, just real. And for the first time that evening, Alexander Reed did not have an immediate response, because for all his power, for all his control, he had never been seen quite like that before, not as a billionaire, not as a name, but as a man whose choices actually meant something. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the quiet between them felt unfamiliar, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something that did not need to be rushed. Alexander looked out over the city again. But this time he was not seeing the skyline he had built his reputation on. He was thinking about the way she had answered him without hesitation, without calculation, as if truth did not require permission. And that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. Most people would have lied, he said after a while, his voice quieter now, less guarded. They would have said something safer. And Emily gave a small shrug, her gaze still fixed on the distant lights. "Safer does not always mean better," she replied, then turned slightly toward him again, her expression soft but unwavering. "And you would have known it was a lie anyway." And that simple statement landed with a weight he could not ignore, because she was right. He always knew. He always saw through the carefully constructed answers people gave him, the ones designed to impress, to secure favor, to stay close to his world. But Emily was not trying to stay. She was just there. A faint sound of music drifted out as the terrace doors opened briefly behind them, laughter spilling into the night before the doors closed again, sealing them back into their quieter space. And Alexander exhaled slowly, almost as if he had forgotten how to do it without tension. "You think you have me figured out," he said, not quite defensive, but not entirely comfortable either. And Emily shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I think you are used to people pretending they do." She paused, then added, "There is a difference." And again, he found himself without a quick response, which was becoming a pattern he did not know how to handle. He shifted slightly, turning more toward her now, his attention no longer divided. "Then what do you think this is?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the ballroom behind them, toward the deal, the check, the entire situation that had brought them there. And Emily followed his motion with her eyes before answering. "It started as a transaction," she said simply. "You needed someone to stand next to you, and I needed the money." She paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the railing again. "But it does not have to stay that simple." And the words lingered between them, not suggesting anything beyond what they meant, but opening a door neither of them had expected. Alexander studied her carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation, any hidden angle, because that was how his world worked. Every interaction carried an intention, every conversation had a purpose, but with her, there was nothing to decode, nothing to anticipate, just a quiet certainty that made everything else feel unnecessary. "You are different from what I expected," he admitted, the words leaving him before he could filter them. And Emily smiled faintly, not surprised, not flattered, just acknowledging it. "That makes two of us," she said softly, and for a brief moment, something almost like amusement flickered in his expression, though it faded quickly, replaced by something more thoughtful, more uncertain. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them, carrying the faint scent of the city below, and Emily wrapped her arms loosely around herself, not out of discomfort, but instinct, and Alexander noticed, his gaze shifting to her bare shoulders, to the thin fabric of the dress that had already endured more than it should have. and without thinking too much about it, he slipped off his jacket, holding it out to her in a quiet gesture that carried no expectation, no performance, just an offer, and she hesitated for only a second before accepting, draping it over her shoulders, the warmth settling around her in a way that felt unexpectedly grounding. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now, and he nodded once, his hands returning to his sides, though something about the exchange lingered, something unspoken but understood. Inside, the music grew louder again, a signal that the main event of the evening was beginning, and Alexander glanced toward the doors, then back at Emily, his expression shifting back towards something more composed, but not entirely the same as before. "We should go back," he said, though there was less distance in his tone now, less command, and she nodded, adjusting the jacket slightly around her shoulders before stepping beside him again. And as they moved toward the doors together, there was a subtle shift in the space between them, no longer defined by a transaction, but by something far less predictable, something that neither of them could control. And as the doors opened and the noise of the ballroom welcomed them back, it was clear that whatever happened next would not follow the rules either of them had started with. The moment they stepped back into the ballroom, the energy felt different, sharper, as if the room itself had been waiting for their return, and this time the attention was not subtle, it was direct, measured, deliberate, because people had noticed something had shifted, even if they could not quite name it. Emily felt it immediately, the way conversations paused just a fraction too long as they passed, the way eyes lingered not on her dress anymore, but on the fact that she walked beside Alexander Reed with a quiet confidence that did not match the story they had already written about her, and somehow that unsettled them more than the stain ever could. Alexander guided her forward without touching her this time, but there was a subtle alignment in their pace, in their direction, as if they had unconsciously agreed to move as one unit, and that alone spoke louder than any introduction he could have made. At the center of the room, a small stage had been set, a microphone waiting. Under a focused beam of light, and the low hum of anticipation began to build as the host of the evening stepped forward, thanking sponsors, acknowledging donors, the usual polished routine that filled spaces like this. But beneath it all, there was a current of curiosity still circling around them. Emily kept her posture steady, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of Alexander's jacket draped over her shoulders, a quiet reminder of the moment on the terrace, of the shift that had taken place outside the reach of everyone else's expectations, and she realized something then, something simple but powerful, that for the first time in a long time, she was not trying to prove anything to anyone in this room. She was just present, exactly as she was. "Stay close," Alexander murmured under his breath, not as a command, but as a shared understanding of what was coming next. And she gave a small nod, her gaze forward, unflinching. The host's voice rose slightly. "And now, we would like to recognize one of our most valued contributors." A pause, a smile, a glance toward the crowd. "Mr. Alexander Reed." And the room responded instantly, applause swelling, polite, practiced, but genuine enough to fill the space. And as all eyes turned toward him, Emily felt the shift again, this time more intense, because now she was no longer just a presence at his side, she was part of the moment. Alexander stepped forward with his usual composure, accepting the acknowledgement with a brief nod. But as he reached the stage, something in his expression hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if the version of himself that belonged here no longer fit quite as perfectly as it once had. He took the microphone, the room settling into attentive silence, and for a moment, he followed the expected rhythm, thanking the organization, recognizing the cause, the words flowing easily, controlled, exactly what they expected from him. But then his gaze shifted, almost involuntarily, back to where Emily stood, and something in that look changed the trajectory of everything. Emily felt it before she understood it, the weight of his attention cutting through the room, not hidden, not subtle, and suddenly the whispers returned, quieter but sharper, because now they were not just observing her. They were questioning her place in this moment, near the edge of the crowd. The same woman who had spilled the wine earlier leaned toward a small group, her voice low but intentional. "You know she works for him, right?" she said, her smile thin, calculated. "She is his housekeeper." And the words spread faster this time. carried by curiosity and disbelief, turning heads, drawing lines that had already been there but were now being spoken out loud. Emily heard it. Of course she did. Not every word, but enough. Enough to understand exactly what was happening. And for a brief second, there was a familiar pull in her chest, the instinct to step back, to disappear into the background where she would not have to stand in front of it. But instead, she inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the same quiet strength she had held onto all night. On the stage, Alexander caught the shift in the room, the subtle change in energy, the way attention fractured and redirected, and he knew, without being told, exactly what had been said, because he had heard variations of it his entire life. People defining others by their place, their role, their perceived value, and for the first time, it did not feel distant. It felt immediate, personal. His grip on the microphone tightened slightly, his prepared words fading into something less certain, less controlled. And as he looked out at the room again, then back at Emily, it became clear that the night was no longer following the script anyone had expected, and whatever came next would not just test her place in that room, it would test his as well. The silence that followed felt heavier than the applause that had come before it, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which version of Alexander Reed would speak next, the polished figure they all recognized or the man who had just looked at Emily Carter as if she mattered more than the script he had prepared. He lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second, then lifted it again, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but different, stripped of the rehearsed cadence that usually defined him. "We spend a lot of time in rooms like this," he began slowly, his eyes moving across the audience, celebrating success, recognizing contributions, reminding ourselves who belongs where. A subtle pause followed, not long, but enough to shift the tone. But sometimes, we forget to ask why. And a ripple of quiet unease moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Emily stood still, her heartbeat steady, though she could feel the weight of every glance, every whispered assumption pressing against her. But she did not look away. She did not shrink. She simply listened, because something in his voice told her this was no longer about appearances. This was something else entirely. Alexander's gaze found her again, not lingering too long, but enough to anchor what he said next. "Tonight, I was reminded that value is not always visible in the ways we expect," he continued, his grip on the microphone loosening slightly, as if he were letting go of something more than just control. "It does not come from titles or invitations or the way someone is introduced in a room." Another pause, this time longer, more deliberate. "Sometimes, it comes from the way a person chooses to stand when the room is waiting for them to fall." And now the silence deepened, no longer uncertain, but attentive, because the words were no longer safe. They were real. Across the floor, the woman who had started the whispers shifted uncomfortably, her expression tightening as the direction of the moment slipped away from her, while others began to look at Emily again, but differently this time, not with dismissal, but with a curiosity that carried a hint of respect they had not intended to offer. Emily felt it, the shift, the subtle recalibration of perception that came not from anything she had said, but from the fact that someone like Alexander Reed had chosen to say it out loud. And for a moment, she did not know what to do with that, because she had never needed anyone to speak for her before. On the stage, Alexander took a slow breath, as if steadying himself, then added, quieter now. "And sometimes, the person you think you are bringing into your world is actually the one showing you how small it has become." The words landed with a quiet force that did not need volume to be felt. And for the first time that evening, there was no applause, no immediate reaction, just a stillness that carried weight. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the jacket around her shoulders, not out of fear, but out of something more complicated, something that felt like recognition and resistance at the same time. Because while his words shifted the room, they also shifted something between them, something that had started as a transaction and was now stepping into unfamiliar territory. Alexander lowered the microphone slowly, his eyes returning to hers, not as a performance, not as a gesture for the audience, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened. And in that look, there was no distance left, no calculation, just a question he did not say out loud, a question about what came next, about whether this moment was something they would both walk away from or something they would have to face together. The host hesitated for a second before stepping back in, his smile slightly less certain now, guiding the program forward. But the rhythm had already been broken. The room no longer felt like it did before, because something had been said that could not be unsaid, something that had shifted. The balance of power without raising a voice. And as the music slowly resumed and conversations cautiously picked back up, it became clear that the night had crossed a line, not one drawn by wealth or status, but by truth. And the only question left was whether that truth would be allowed to stand or be quietly pushed aside like everything else that did not fit the rules of the room. The music resumed, softer at first, as if the room itself needed a moment to recover, but the atmosphere had already changed in a way that no melody could smooth over. Conversations restarting in fragments, glances exchanged more carefully now, as though everyone was recalculating what they had just witnessed and what it meant for their carefully balanced world. Emily stood exactly where she had been, the weight of the moment still settling around her, not overwhelming, not suffocating, but undeniable, because what Alexander had said had not just shifted how others saw her. It had placed her in a position she had never asked for, the center of a narrative she had not written. She exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the edge of his jacket again, grounding herself, reminding herself that nothing about who she was had changed, not really, no matter how the room decided to reinterpret her. A few guests approached cautiously, their smiles polite, their questions measured, no longer dismissive but not entirely genuine either, as if they were testing the boundaries of this new version of her. That was quite a statement. One woman said lightly, her tone balanced between curiosity and calculation, and Emily met her gaze with the same calm she had held all night. It was his, she replied simply, offering nothing more, and the woman hesitated, clearly expecting something different, something that would allow her to categorize Emily again, but finding none, she nodded and moved on, her uncertainty lingering behind her like a shadow. Across the room, Alexander stepped down from the stage, his expression composed once more, but the distance he usually carried was gone, replaced by something quieter, more present. And as he made his way back toward Emily, the path seemed to open for him, not just out of respect, but out of a subtle shift in perception, because now he was not just the man they admired, he was the man who had disrupted their expectations. When he reached her, he did not speak immediately, just stood beside her for a moment, allowing the silence to settle naturally, as if neither of them needed to fill it right away, and Emily glanced at him briefly, searching his expression for something she could not quite name, finding no regret, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that made everything feel more complicated than it had been before. "You did not have to do that," she said finally, her voice low, steady, not accusing, just honest, and he looked at her, really looked at her, as if considering the weight of her words before answering. "Yes, I did," he replied, just as quietly, and the simplicity of it left no room for argument, because it was not about obligation. It was about choice. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air, sharper this time, no longer disguised behind whispers. "Interesting." The same woman stepped forward, her smile controlled but her eyes less so. "I did not realize we were celebrating staff contributions tonight." A few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, the tension returning in a different form, more direct, more deliberate, and Emily felt it again. That pull, that moment where the room tried to define her, to reduce her back to something manageable, something that fit within their expectations. Alexander's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his attention shifting fully toward the woman, his expression cooling just enough to signal that this was no longer a passive exchange. But before he could speak, Emily placed a gentle hand against his arm, not to stop him, but to ground him, to remind him that this was not his fight to take over. She stepped forward instead, her movement calm, unhurried, drawing the attention of those closest to them without raising her voice. And for a brief second, the entire room seemed to narrow its focus again, waiting, watching, anticipating a reaction they could understand, something emotional, something predictable. But Emily Carter had already proven she was not predictable, and as she met the woman's gaze directly, her expression composed, her voice steady. It became clear that whatever came next would not restore the balance they were trying so hard to maintain. It would break it completely. Emily did not raise her voice. She did not step back, and she did not look at anyone else in the room for reassurance. She simply held the woman's gaze as if the rest of the ballroom had faded into the background, and when she finally spoke, her tone was calm, almost conversational. "You are right," she said, and the unexpected agreement caused a flicker of confusion to pass through the woman's expression, a subtle crack in the certainty she had carried into the moment. Emily continued without hesitation, her voice steady, clear enough for those nearby to hear without forcing it. "I do work for him," she added, and now the whispers shifted again, no longer speculative but confirmed, a ripple of quiet reactions spreading outward. But Emily did not stop there. She did not allow the statement to define her the way they expected. Instead, she took a small step forward, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded. "I clean his house," she said, and this time the words landed differently, not as a confession, but as a statement of fact that carried no shame, no apology, and that alone unsettled the balance they had tried to maintain. The woman let out a soft, almost dismissive laugh, as if trying to regain control of the narrative. "Then perhaps this is not exactly your scene," she replied, her tone light but edged, and a few nearby guests shifted, waiting for Emily to retreat, to falter, to confirm the hierarchy they were comfortable with. But instead, Emily's expression softened slightly, not in defeat, but in quiet understanding. "No," she said gently, "it is not." And for a brief second, it seemed as though she had given them what they wanted, a simple acknowledgement of her place, something they could accept and move past. But then she added, just as calmly, "But neither is pretending to be someone you are not." And the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need volume to be felt. A silence followed, deeper. This time, more complete, because what she had said did not attack anyone directly. Yet it reached all of them, touching the unspoken truth beneath the polished surface of the evening. And one by one, the confident expressions around her began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to reveal something less certain beneath. Emily glanced briefly at Alexander, not for approval, not for validation, just a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, before turning back to the woman, her voice still, steady, still controlled. "You see, a housekeeper," she continued, "and that is fine. That is part of who I am. But it is not all of who I am." She paused, letting the words settle, not rushing to fill the space. "And tonight, I did not come here to be someone else," she added, her fingers lightly adjusting the jacket around her shoulders. "I came here exactly as I am." And there was something in the way she said it, something grounded and unshakable, that made it impossible to dismiss as arrogance or defiance. It was simply truth, and truth, in a room built on appearances, was harder to ignore than anything else. The woman's smile faltered, just for a moment, her composure slipping in a way that could not be hidden, and around them, the atmosphere shifted once more, not back to what it had been before, but into something new, something quieter, more reflective, as if the room itself had been forced to reconsider the rules it had always followed. Alexander watched her, not as the man who had hired her, not as the figure everyone else deferred to, but as someone witnessing a moment he could not control. And for the first time that evening, it was not his presence that commanded the room. It was hers, not through power or status, but through something far less expected, something that could not be bought or arranged or performed. And as the silence lingered just a little longer than anyone anticipated, it became clear that whatever assumptions had filled the room at the start of the night no longer held the same weight, because Emily Carter had just rewritten them without ever raising her voice. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have anything to say, but because for once, there was nothing easy to say, and in a room that thrived on quick responses and polished reactions, that kind of silence felt almost unfamiliar. Emily did not rush to fill it. She simply stood there, exactly as she had been all night, grounded, steady, unchanged by the shift she had just created, and that was what made it real, because nothing about her had transformed, only the way they were forced to see her. Alexander stepped forward then, not in front of her, not to shield her, but beside her, his presence aligning with hers in a way that no longer felt like arrangement. but choice. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the space without needing to rise. "I think the only thing more uncomfortable than truth," he said calmly, his gaze moving across the crowd, "is realizing you have been avoiding it." And a few people shifted, some lowering their eyes, others offering small, uncertain smiles as if trying to smooth over something that could not be smoothed. He turned slightly toward the woman who had challenged Emily, his expression composed, but no longer distant. "You see roles," he added. "Titles, positions, labels that make things easier to understand." A brief pause, measured, deliberate, but you miss the only thing that actually matters. And without raising his voice, without adding emphasis, he made it clear that the moment was no longer about defending anyone. It was about redefining the entire conversation. The woman opened her mouth as if to respond, then hesitated, her confidence no longer as solid as it had been, because there was nothing in his tone that invited debate, only reflection, and for the first time that evening, she looked at Emily not as an interruption to the evening, but as something she had underestimated. Emily felt the shift fully now, not as pressure, not as judgment, but as space that had been closed to her before, and she understood something in that moment that surprised even her, that this was not about being accepted into their world, it was about no longer needing to be. She reached into the small clutch she had carried all night, her movements unhurried, and when she pulled out the folded check, the same one that had started everything, a quiet ripple moved through those closest enough to see it, curiosity sharpening again. But this time it was different, not dismissive, but attentive. Emily looked at it for a brief second, then extended it toward Alexander, her hand steady, her expression calm. "I think this belongs to you," she said softly. And for a moment, he did not take it, not out of confusion, but because he understood what the gesture meant, not rejection, not defiance, but clarity. "I agreed to be here," she continued, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "And I am glad I came." A small pause, her gaze meeting his directly. "But I do not need to be paid to stand where I already belong." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. Alexander took the check slowly, not breaking eye contact, and something in his expression shifted again, something softer, something more certain, because in that moment, the transaction that had defined the beginning of the night was gone, replaced by something neither of them had planned, something real. He folded the check once, then slipped it into his pocket without looking at it, his attention still on her. And when he spoke, it was not to the room, not to the expectations that had shaped him for years, but to her. "Then stay," he said quietly, the simplicity of it carrying more weight than anything else he could have offered. "Not because of an agreement, not because of tonight," he added, a faint shift in his tone, almost vulnerable. "Stay because you choose to." And Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, considering not the room, not the people watching, but the man standing in front of her, the one who had stepped out of his own script just as much as she had stepped out of theirs. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to show that she understood exactly what was being offered, and exactly what it meant. And in that quiet exchange, without applause, without announcement, the balance of everything had changed, not because someone had won, but because both of them had chosen something different, something that did not fit the room they stood in, but somehow made it feel more real than it ever had before.